Um, what I was saying is that in terms of gender roles, we teach young girls to be cooks, we teach them to be good with babies, etc. So nowadays in our American society, women are still held responsible for most of the child rearing, and they're still kind of held responsible for doing the cooking, even though women work nowadays. Most mothers, at least, um, work. And again, what I was saying before is that there's always going to be exceptions, okay? In whatever we're talking about in this course, you'll always find some exceptions. But what we as sociologists acknowledge are patterns, and this is certainly a pattern. So again, gender roles is an example of socialization. We socialize boys and girls to take on specific roles. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about socialization and some of the places that socialization occurs and some of the roles that we learn to occupy, let's stop for a second and take a step back and talk about what it means for something to be socially constructed. This is probably the most important term that you can take away from a sociology class, that something being socially constructed. And what that basically means is constructed meaning built or made up. Construction, think construction worker, something that's built. So something that's a social construction is built by society. It's made up by society. And it means that people give meaning to certain things, certain ideas, certain behaviors, etc. For example, a handshake. Um, there's nothing that says that a one person shaking hands with another person is indefinitely and naturally, innately a symbol of um, greeting somebody. We instead give meaning to that handshake in society. And again, this happens through the process of socialization because as young children, we grow up watching people shake hands. We're taught to shake hands. It's something that we do at the individual level, but it's the symbolic nature of it that gives it its meaning, and we decide to give it that meaning. So, for example, if you go to a country in Southeast Asia that does not have the practice of handshaking, and you try to shake someone's hand, they might look at you and wonder what the heck you're doing because that has no meaning to them. It's not something that is shared in their society. It's not something that's embedded in everyday interactions amongst people in that society. In order to understand symbolic interactionism, which is one of the major perspectives that we talked about in the last lecture, um, understanding this concept of social construction is very important because it says that people's basic actions and beliefs are a product of these shared meanings, these shared symbols that happen every day through individual interactions. Irving Goffman came up with a very interesting theory called the dramaturgical theory. And he actually got his original idea from Shakespeare, who once wrote that all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. What Irving Goffman says is that life is essentially like a theatrical performance. Um, Everything we do all day long, the different places where we are, the different people that we're talking to, whether we're going to work, whether we're on the subway or the bus, whether we are in the coffee shop, whether we're in a job interview, whether we're with our family members, whether we're at a party, that almost every scenario that people find themselves in is kind of like a play, and everybody has a role. Everybody basically knows what they're going to say, what they're going to talk about. And again, this is where socialization comes into play because you go into a classroom and you have a certain role that you play, the student. You sit down quietly, you wait for the teacher to speak before you start speaking, and you play this role, and it's almost like a play. And You have your part and the teacher has his or her part. And there's a script, and the script is the basic dialogue that's happening. So your teacher might say hello, and they might start to talk about some of the things that are due that next week, and then go into the lecture. They're not going to start talking about something totally having nothing to do with academic stuff. So they're not going to start talking about some movie. You can make little comments here and there, but you're not going to have a dialogue where you go to class and then your teacher talks about a movie all class period long. So the dramaturgical theory states that throughout these different situations that we find ourselves in, we basically know what we're going to say. We basically know how we're going to act. Um, and we basically know what the outcome of the situation is going to be. Another example is when you go to an interview. You know that you're going to have a certain type of conversation with your interviewer. Um, you know where the conversation is going to go. Then when you leave to go to, say, your girlfriend's parents' house, you know what the type of conversation that you're going to have there. You know what kind of etiquette you're going to perform. So again, life is like a performance. It's a very interesting way of looking at life. And again, it has a lot to do with socialization because we are taught how to behave in certain situations. We don't just learn them spontaneously. Sometimes we have to relearn them through a process of re-socialization, but essentially at some point we are taught and we learn how to behave and we follow those rules if we want to fit in. Now, whether or not you agree with the dramaturgical theory is up to you, but there is some truth in the fact that people, for the most part, follow the social norms of society, and more often than not, people do try to fit in instead of stand out. It's a mechanism for survival. As humans, we need stability in our lives. We need harmony, we need social cohesion, and we need people to follow the rules. For example, wearing clothing, not talking to ourselves or screaming or singing in public, shaking hands, smiling, holding doors, etc. We need all these rules. We need people to follow these rules in order for human interactions to go smoothly and for society to function smoothly. One of the methods that have been used in the past to understand certain social norms has been a method called ethnomethodology, which was developed by Harold Garfinkel. Um, and basically, that approach is completely violating norms, sending researchers out to violate norms. So, for example, sending someone to an elevator and asking them to stand facing all the people in the elevator instead of facing the door, and to record and see what happens and what are the reactions of people when people do violate these norms. And it was an interesting concept, an interesting approach, because it allows us to understand even more clearly these different types of norms and how important they are. When you violate a norm, that's when you really start to understand just how important and just how deeply embedded these norms are. And they're subconscious. We don't normally think about these types of things. So this is kind of the basis for the symbolic interactionist um, perspective. It's an extremely interesting perspective. It does have its downfalls, however. For example, if all we're looking at is individual interactions, behaviors on the individual level, then we can miss out on how larger social forces affect human behavior. For example, remember that example that I told you about families and how they changed depending on the subsistence technology, depending on the economic system, the system of production. So before the Industrial Revolution, during agricultural times, the family was much more extended. They lived amongst their family members, either in that same house or in the same neighborhood. There was not such a division of labor. Kinship ties were really strong, etc., etc. Then all of these things kind of changed once the Industrial Revolution occurred because people moved from the countryside to the cities. People took on much more specialized jobs. So you had a much higher division of labor. You had people not interacting in the same way that they were before because they weren't on the farm where um, where you're taking on similar roles as all of your neighbors. You're doing similar things every single day, and you are in a bubble, so to speak. So symbolic interaction is can sometimes forget how larger social forces can have an impact on individual behaviors. So we need to consider that when thinking about this perspective. But that concludes our chapter on socialization. Again, this was a brief overview. Make sure you read your chapter and do all the activities so that you could really grasp and understand these concepts. Good luck, and I will see you in the next chapter.